They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones they try to erase completely. In the heart of Central Asia, at a time when empires were crumbling and revolutions sweeping the world, a small but determined group of Muslim intellectuals, scholars, visionaries declared something extraordinary: an independent Islamic republic. Democratic in structure and rooted in both modern values and Islamic tradition. It was 1917. The Russian Tsar had just fallen, and the chaos of revolution had opened a window brief, fragile, and dangerous. From this window emerged the Kokand Autonomy, also known as the Turkestan Autonomy, a Muslim-majority self-declared republic that lasted only a few months before it was brutally crushed by the rising Soviet machine. And then, silence, as if it had never existed. The story of this forgotten Islamic republic is not just a story of lost statehood, it's a story of dreams, resistance, erasure, and what could have been. Why was this republic so threatening to the Soviet regime? Why was its memory so deliberately wiped from textbooks, archives, and public consciousness? And more importantly, what if it had survived? What kind of precedent would it have set for the modern Muslim world? In this video, we dive deep into a suppressed chapter of history that very few even know existed: the rise and fall of the Kokand Autonomy, to understand how such a moment was even possible. We must begin in a world on the brink of transformation. The year is 1917. The First World War rages across Europe. The Russian Empire, weakened and divided, collapses from within. The Bolsheviks rise in Petrograd, promising land, peace, and power to the people. But in the far stretches of the empire, in the vast deserts and valleys of Central Asia, a different kind of dream is unfolding. The region we now know as Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and parts of Kazakhstan had long been under Russian control, but never truly absorbed. The people of Turkestan, mostly Muslims of Turkic heritage, maintained strong cultural, religious, and linguistic identities. Moscow's influence had reached them through military conquest and colonial administration, but its grip was shallow. Beneath the surface, resistance had been simmering for decades. And now, with the fall of the Tsar and chaos engulfing Russia, that resistance was ready to burst into a full-fledged movement for independence. In the Fergana Valley, a historical center of Islamic learning and commerce, Muslim intellectuals, religious scholars, reformists, and political leaders came together. These were not radicals. They were teachers, poets, jurists, and editors. Many were part of the Jadid movement, a wave of Islamic modernism that sought to revive Muslim societies through education, reform, and engagement with modern science and governance. Inspired by both their faith and global calls for self-determination, they envisioned a new republic, not a theocracy, not a puppet of any empire, but a democratic, Islamic nation governed by its own people. On November 27, 1917, just weeks after the Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd, they declared the Turkestan Autonomy in the city of Kokand. It was to be an independent Islamic republic with its own government, parliament, and courts. A bold experiment, fusing modern governance with deep-rooted Islamic values. The republic's founders promised equality, civil rights, religious freedom, and participation in political life for all, including minorities and women. It was revolutionary, not in the Marxist sense, but in its aspiration to prove that Islam and democracy were not mutually exclusive. But this hopeful republic was born into a storm. The Bolsheviks, newly in power, viewed all non-socialist governments as enemies, especially ones that combined religion with politics. They considered the Kokand Autonomy a threat to the unity of the new Soviet state and a spark for further nationalist movements. Within weeks, Moscow sent in the Red Army. The people of Turkestan were unprepared for the scale and brutality of the attack that followed. In February 1918, less than 3 months after its formation, the coconut autonomy was obliterated in a violent crackdown. Thousands were killed. Coconut was shelled and burned. Its leaders were executed or exiled. The dream of a democratic Islamic republic in Central Asia was shattered not by internal failure, but by force. And after the physical destruction came the erasure. Soviet historians ensured that the memory of this republic was buried. Schoolbooks never mentioned it. Generations grew up unaware that their ancestors had once dared to dream of something so bold. But history has a way of resurfacing. In scattered archives, in the oral histories of elders, and in the fading documents hidden in private collections, pieces of the truth still exist. And in the next part of this journey, we'll go back even further to understand the roots of this movement, the conditions that made such a republic even thinkable, and the Islamic reformists who dared to write a new chapter, even if it was torn from the book. To understand how the cocoa and autonomy emerged and why it was so revolutionary, we have to journey back several decades. To the mid-19th century, when the Russian Empire began its aggressive expansion into Central Asia, the Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand, once powerful Islamic states with rich histories of scholarship and trade, had been independent for centuries. But by the 1860s and 1870s, Russian military campaigns had subdued them one by one. The conquest wasn't just about territory, it was about domination of identity. The Russians introduced new legal systems, replaced traditional Islamic courts, controlled the economy, established settler colonies that altered the demographic balance in key cities. Yet, despite their success in conquering the land, they failed to win the hearts and minds of the local Muslim population. Russian administrators viewed the people of Turkestan as backward and in need of civilizing, and this colonial mindset bred deep resentment. Islam, which had long been the cornerstone of identity in Central Asia, became a symbol of resistance. Mosques, madrasas, and religious leaders became not only spiritual centers but political symbols of a defiant cultural heritage. In this atmosphere of suppression and control, a new intellectual awakening began to stir a reform movement known as Jadidism, derived from the Arabic word jadid, meaning new. The Jadid movement emerged in the late 19th century among Muslim intellectuals who believed the key to revival was neither rebellion nor isolation, but education and reform.
They sought to
modernize Islamic society by updating traditional religious schools, incorporating subjects like mathematics, geography, and science, and promoting critical thinking alongside religious education. The Jadids were not anti-Islamic, far from it. They were deeply devout but believed that Islam was being misrepresented as anti-progress by both imperialists and conservative clerics. Their goal was to prove that Islam could coexist with modernity, that Muslim societies could be leaders in knowledge, governance, and culture once again. Through newspapers, pamphlets, theater, and modern schools, they quietly built a base of support across Central Asia, especially in urban centers like Tashkent, Bukhara, Kaka. This intellectual awakening laid the ideological foundation for what would later become the cocoa and autonomy. Many of the leaders who declared independence in 1917 were once Jadid teachers or writers. Their vision of an Islamic republic wasn't about creating a theocracy. It was about reclaiming dignity, self-rule, and modern Islamic identity in a world that saw Muslims only as subjects of empire. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire was fraying. By the early 20th century, the cracks were showing. Wars, economic troubles, and revolutionary ideas had begun to eat away at the imperial structure. The 1905 Russian Revolution, though unsuccessful in toppling the Tsar, shook the empire too. Its core gave a brief window of opportunity to minority groups across Russia. In Turkestan, Muslims used this moment to organize, to publish openly, and to discuss political rights for the first time in decades. But this freedom was short-lived. The Tsar tightened control again, and in 1916, disaster struck. Facing pressure, in World War I, the Russian government issued a decree forcing Central Asian Muslims, who had previously been exempt, into labor battalions to support the war effort. This decision ignited the Central Asian Revolt of 1916, also known as the Urkhan. Tens of thousands of Muslims rose up in protest, and Russian forces responded with overwhelming brutality. Villages were destroyed, people were slaughtered, and tens of thousands fled to neighboring regions like China. The revolt deepened the divide between Russian rulers and Muslim subjects and set the stage for something even bigger, a total break from imperial control. By 1917, the Tsar had fallen, the Russian Empire collapsed. And in that chaotic, uncertain power vacuum, the Jadid, dreamers, the teachers, the reformers, the thinkers, saw their chance to build something new, something their ancestors could never have imagined under empire: republic, Islamic, democratic, independent. This was the world that birthed the coconut autonomy, not in a vacuum, but in the fires of colonization, revolt, and revival. The next part, we will witness how these dreamers gathered in the historic city of Coconut, drafted their constitution, and declared an Islamic republic in the shadow of the Soviet Revolution. In the final weeks of 1917, as Russia convulsed with revolution and the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, Central Asia stood at a crossroads. Far removed from the political heart of the collapsing empire, the people of Turkestan were watching closely, not just because of what was happening in Moscow, but because of what it meant for their future. The Tsar was gone. The Russian provisional government had fallen. The Bolsheviks were rising with slogans of equality, workers' rights, and land for the peasants. But their promises, wrapped in Marxist ideology, came with one unspoken clause: absolute control by the center, in Tashkent. The Bolsheviks quickly moved to establish authority through the formation of the Tashkent Soviet, a local branch of Soviet power. But there was a problem. The Tashkent Soviet excluded the region's Muslim population from any real decision-making. Though Muslims made up the vast majority in Central Asia, their voices were absent in the new political structures. To the Muslim reformers and Jadid intellectuals who had long dreamed of self-determination, this was the clearest sign yet. The Soviets had no intention of honoring local autonomy or religious identity. And so, a bold decision was made. On November 26, 1917, just weeks after the Bolshevik coup in Russia, a historic congress of Muslim leaders, ulama, reformers, and representatives from various Central Asian regions gathered in the city of Coconut, a cultural and spiritual stronghold in the Fergana Valley. The gathering was charged with urgency.
Now what would become of Turkestan?
Would it fall under Bolshevik rule, or chart its own path? The Congress didn't hesitate. In a sweeping declaration, they announced the formation of the Turkestan Autonomy, commonly referred to as the Kokand Autonomy due to its headquarters in the city. It would be a secular, democratic, Islamic republic, rooted in local traditions, but open to modern governance. The new republic was to be governed by a parliament, composed of both Muslims and non-Muslims, and an executive council that reflected the multi-ethnic makeup of the region. It was an act of political imagination that stood in stark contrast to the ideological rigidity of the Bolsheviks. The leader of this new autonomy was Mustafa Shoke, a brilliant Kazakh intellectual and seasoned political figure who had previously served in the Russian Duma. Shoke believed that the only way for Turkestan's people to truly flourish was through independence, not just from Russian domination, but from imperial ideologies of all kinds. He saw in the Coconut Autonomy a chance to create a just society where Islamic values could coexist with civil rights, where education and law were modernized, and where power was decentralized and accountable. The Republic's vision was extraordinary. For its time, the proposed constitution emphasized equality of all citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity. It recognized Islam as a central cultural force, but did not mandate theocracy. It promoted free education, legal reforms, women's inclusion, and local governance. In a region long plagued by colonial control and internal divisions, the Kokand Autonomy was a call for unity and a symbol of what Muslim-majority governance could look like in the modern world. But even as these ideals took shape, dark clouds gathered, the Bolsheviks now consolidating power across former imperial territories. viewed the coconut autonomy not as a regional solution, but as a direct threat. They branded its leaders as counter-revolutionaries. The Tashkent Soviet, still refusing to recognize Muslim leadership, declared the coconut autonomy illegitimate and called for its destruction. And behind their rhetoric of workers' rights and equality, a brutal military campaign was already being prepared. Despite the gravity of the threat, the coconut leaders tried to avoid war. They sent delegations to Tashkent and Moscow seeking negotiation. They appealed to Lenin's own promises of self-determination for national minorities, but their words fell on deaf ears. The Bolsheviks had already made their decision. Under their terms would be enforced at any cost. In the meantime, the coconut autonomy began operating as a real government. It opened schools, it reorganized local administration. It encouraged newspapers and civic participation. Though under constant pressure, it managed to inspire hope among thousands across Central Asia. For many, this short-lived republic was the first time they felt politically represented in any form. But this fragile flame was about to be snuffed out. It began quietly. The world barely noticed. In early 1918, while Europe was still locked in the bloodshed of World War I and the Bolsheviks were solidifying power in Moscow, a silent storm began brewing in Central Asia. The coconut autonomy, that hopeful, fragile republic, was surrounded. On all sides, Bolshevik forces gathered under the banner of revolution, determined to bring Turkestan under direct Soviet control. The people of Coconut, still clinging to the possibility of peaceful coexistence, did not expect the scale of the violence that was about to descend upon them. By February 1918, negotiations between Coconut and the Tashkent Soviet had completely collapsed. The Soviets, led by military commanders loyal to Lenin's central authority, decided that no autonomous Muslim government would be tolerated, especially one that blended religion with politics. The coconut autonomy, in their eyes, was not a regional experiment in self-rule. It was rebellion. Then came the orders: eliminate the coconut government by force. The Red Army moved fast. Armed with artillery, trained soldiers, and ideological zeal, they advanced toward the Fergana Valley. Kokon, despite its passionate leadership and community support, had little means of defense. Its militia was small, poorly equipped, and primarily made up of volunteers, farmers, clerics, students, not professional fighters. They had no heavy weapons, no outside allies, no hope of matching the firepower of the Bolshevik machine. The attack was swift, brutal, and horrifying. Kokon was shelled from a distance. Its neighborhoods, once buzzing with schools, markets, and mosques, were torn apart by artillery. As the Red Army entered the city, street battles erupted. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Houses were set ablaze. Witnesses later described scenes of chaos: women and children running through smoke-filled alleys, scholars clutching books and Qurans as flames swallowed libraries, cries of surrender drowned out by the crackle of gunfire. For 3 days, the city burned. The coconut leadership was either executed or forced into exile. Mustafa Shoke, realizing the futility of resistance, fled, beginning a life in exile that would take him across Europe, as he tried desperately to tell the world what had happened to his homeland. But few listened. Russia was changing fast, and global attention was elsewhere. In total, it is estimated that 10,000 to 14,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed during the massacre of Kokon. It wasn't just a military assault, it was a message. There would be no Islamic Republic within Soviet territory, no autonomy, no alternative models of governance. The Soviets not only destroyed the Republic, they obliterated the very idea that it had ever existed. And then, silence began. The new Soviet authorities quickly moved to erase the memory of the coconut autonomy. Documents were destroyed, archives were redacted. School children in Tashkent and Samarkand grew up never hearing of the republic that had once stood in their own backyard. History textbooks made no mention of the Jaded reformers, the democratic constitution, or the peaceful attempt to create an Islamic democracy. The survivors who remembered it were too afraid to speak. Those who did were branded as traitors or imperialists, enemies of the state. For decades, the story of the Coconut autonomy lived only in whispers. It was a deliberate act of historical erasure. Unlike the fall of other short-lived republics or failed revolutions, the Coconut autonomy wasn't just defeated, it was buried, denied, and rewritten. And yet fragments of the truth survived. Memoirs smuggled out by exiles. Foreign newspaper reports. Secret letters. Oral histories passed from grandfather to grandson. Pieces of a forgotten past waiting to be reassembled. In the next part, Yanni will follow what happened after the destruction, how the Soviets rebuilt Turkestan, in their image, and how they ensured that Islam, identity, and autonomy would be reshaped, suppressed, and controlled for generations. After the bloodbath in Kokand, the Soviets weren't satisfied with just destroying a political experiment. They wanted to reprogram the very soul of Central Asia. That meant targeting Islam. For centuries, Islam wasn't just a religion in the region. It was the heartbeat of daily life, the framework of morality, education, justice, and culture. Mosques weren't just places of worship. They were schools, community centers, courts. Ulama, Islamic scholars, were leaders, teachers, mediators. Faith wasn't separate from governance. It was governance. The Bolsheviks, driven by Marxist-Leninist ideology, believed religion was a tool of oppression, a superstition used to enslave the working class. Their goal was clear: eradicate religion from the public sphere. But in Central Asia, this meant doing more than just closing mosques. It meant dismantling a civilization. The campaign began subtly in the 1920s. Soviet authorities launched literacy programs across Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. While they taught people to read a good thing on the surface, the goal wasn't knowledge for knowledge's sake, it was indoctrination. Quranic schools were replaced with state-run red schools. Religious books were burned or confiscated. Teachers were forced to use Russian-approved curriculum. Arabic script was outlawed and replaced by Cyrillic, severing the younger generation from centuries of Islamic literature. Mosques were shuttered. Many were converted into warehouses, stables, or clubs for the Komsomol, the communist youth. League imams who resisted were arrested, exiled, or executed. Public prayer was discouraged. Fasting during Ramadan was considered anti-Soviet behavior. Parents were warned, if your child sees you praying, they might report you to the authorities, because children were being trained to see religion as the enemy of progress, and it worked. By the 1930s, a generation had grown up without access to traditional Islamic knowledge. They could no longer read classical Persian, Arabic, or even Old Uzbek. They didn't know the names of famous scholars from Bukhara. They were disconnected from their theological roots, not by choice, but by state engineering. This wasn't just repression. It was systematic cultural engineering. The Soviets created new official Islam, the institution's tightly controlled state. Muftiyates, Islamic boards that would preach obedience to the USSR. Friday's sermons were monitored. Religious leaders were chosen not for piety, but for loyalty to the party. In effect, a fake version of Islam was promoted, one that supported the state, denounced politics, and stayed silent on identity. But beneath the surface, the real Islam survived. In villages across the Fergana Valley, in the narrow alleys of Samarkand, in remote corners of the steppe, elders kept knowledge alive. In whispered gatherings, Qurans were read. Prayers were performed in basements. Children learned Arabic from grandfathers by candlelight. It was not organized resistance, it was survival. Quiet, cautious, determined. The Jadids, those early reformers who dreamed of an enlightened Islamic republic, were either dead or silenced, but their legacy lingered in the shadows. It's kept alive by those who refuse to forget. J.A.N.I. in the next part. We'll explore how Stalin's terror in World War II impacted Central Asia further, and why the Soviet leadership began to soften its stance toward Islam, but only when it served their purpose. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the USSR was caught off guard. The Red Army was underprepared. The people were demoralized. And Joseph Stalin, once the harshest persecutor of religion, realized something unexpected. Faith could be useful. The Soviet Union needed unity, morale, a reason for millions to fight, especially in Muslim-majority regions like Central Asia. Suddenly, Islam, which had been crushed for 2 decades, was quietly welcomed back into the public sphere. But only as long as it served the war effort. Stalin reopened a few mosques. He allowed the publication of limited religious materials. He even established the spiritual administration of the Muslims of Central Asia and Kazakhstan, a state-controlled Islamic body headquartered in Tashkent. Its job: to rally Muslim support for the war while staying completely loyal to the Communist Party. Imams were instructed to deliver Friday sermons supporting the Red Army. Quranic verses about justice and defending the oppressed were selectively used to justify fighting Hitler. Muslim soldiers were praised as heroes. Central Asian poets were commissioned to write Islamic-themed war propaganda. It worked. Tens of thousands of Central Asian Muslims enlisted or were conscripted into the Red Army. Some saw it as patriotic duty. Others saw it as a lesser evil. Some believed, thanks to careful Soviet messaging, that defending the USSR was not a betrayal of Islam, but a defense of homeland and family. But as soon as the war ended in 1945, the repression quietly resumed. Yes, the Soviets didn't return to the mass executions of the 1930s. But they did begin tightening control again. The official Islamic bodies remained, but only to present a harmless, apolitical version of Islam to the world. Foreign journalists visiting Uzbekistan were shown well-maintained mosques. Muslim leaders were paraded as symbols of Soviet tolerance, but underground real Islamic scholarship remained banned. The true Islamic tradition, dynamic, political, philosophical, remained in hiding. This duality, Islam as a propaganda tool versus Islam as a cultural identity, became the new Soviet reality. On one hand, Central Asia was promoted internationally as proof that Islam and communism could coexist. On the other hand, the real spirit of Islamic governance, justice, and scholarship was still suppressed by the 1960s and 70s. Central Asia looked like a fully Soviet region. Concrete buildings, Russian language dominance, Lenin statues in every square. But deep down, under the surface, the old questions still lingered. Who are we? What happened to our Islamic Republic dream? And can faith survive under false freedom? By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was facing pressures it could no longer ignore. It's economically stagnant, politically rigid, and socially disconnected, especially in the Muslim republics of Central Asia. Then 2 things happened that shook the ideological foundation of Soviet Central Asia: the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, where a pro-Western monarchy was overthrown and replaced by a theocratic Islamic government. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was also in 1979, right at the southern border of Central Asia. The timing couldn't have been worse for Moscow. For decades, Soviets had tried to convince Central Asian Muslims that Islam was a relic of the past, a tool of feudal oppressors. But the Islamic Revolution in Iran proved otherwise. Millions of Muslims around the world watched as a new Islamic Republic, bold, modern, and unapologetically religious, emerged on the world stage. In Central Asia, this sparked something silent but powerful: hope. Meanwhile, the Soviet war in Afghanistan became an even more direct threat to the stability of the USSR's Muslim South. Central Asian soldiers were sent to fight their fellow Muslims across the border. The imagery was impossible to ignore. Russian commanders ordering Uzbek, Tajik, and Kazakh conscripts to kill Afghans in the name of communism. It was deeply unsettling. Whispers began to spread. Underground Islamic literature circulated once again. Illegal Quran study groups formed in basements. Young men traveled secretly to Pakistan or Iran to study Islam, and from within the Soviet prisons, former Islamic thinkers and scholars began writing quietly, planting ideological seeds that would sprout a decade later. the Soviets responded. With more surveillance, more propaganda, more arrests, but they were losing the cultural war. Islam wasn't dead. It had simply gone underground. And now, the ground was starting to shake. By the late 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet Union were visible. The Berlin Wall was falling. Glasnost and perestroika had opened the door to political dissent. And in Central Asia, that meant something. Once unthinkable, open religious expression. Mosques reopened. Islamic education slowly re-emerged. And most importantly, the memory of that forgotten Islamic republic began returning. The question was no longer, can we revive our Islamic identity? It became, what happens when we finally can? In 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed. For the 5 Central Asian republics Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, this was a historic moment. After nearly 70 years of Soviet rule, they were now independent countries, but independence came with confusion. These nations had no clear national ideology, no strong democratic structures, no deeply rooted Islamic system. A generation of leaders raised under Soviet communism, the result. Most of them chose the safe route to continue with authoritarian, Soviet-style governance under new national flags. Even the dream of a united, Central Asian Islamic Republic faded fast. There were several reasons for this. Leadership vacuum. The new presidents, like Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan and Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, were former Communist Party elites. They feared religious revival more than they welcomed it. Ethnic divisions. Though all 5 nations had shared Islamic and cultural roots, they were now being told they were different. Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, Tajik, new flags, new anthems. New borders, old unity. Forgotten. Fear of extremism. The rise of groups like the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan and civil war in Tajikistan made governments nervous. Any sign of Islamic political movement was treated as a threat, not a solution. Foreign influence. The West, particularly the US, entered the region to ensure Islam didn't dominate in the post-Soviet vacuum. Meanwhile, Russia tried to keep its grip through economic and military influence. What emerged in the 1990s was a kind of hybrid identity. Islam was acknowledged culturally, but not politically. Mosques were allowed, but Islamic parties were banned. Religious leaders were monitored or handpicked by the state. In essence, Central Asia became free, but not truly independent of its past. The idea of a modern Islamic republic based on justice, unity, and faith that once flickered during the short-lived revolution remained buried in history. The youth of the region began growing up in nations that were neither fully secular like Europe or fully Islamic like some Middle Eastern states. They lived in a limbo, Muslim in name, but disconnected in spirit. On September 11, 2001, the world changed as the Twin Towers fell in New York. A global war on terror began, and once again, Central Asia found itself in the crosshairs of history. Although the attackers had no connection to the region, the global perception of Islam began to shift drastically from a faith to a security threat. For Central Asia, this created a strange opportunity and an even stranger consequence. Western powers return, not for democracy, but for stability. The United States needed bases close to Afghanistan for its military operations. Uzbekistan allowed the US to use the Karshi-Khanabad Airbase. Kyrgyzstan opened the Manas Airbase for US operations. In return, these authoritarian regimes received billions in aid, military training, and legitimacy without needing to become democratic or uphold human rights. It was a trade-off. You help us fight the war on terror. We'll ignore how you rule your people. But this came with a price. To stay in the good books of the West, Central Asian governments began cracking down on any form of Islamic activism, even peaceful ones. Islam equals extremism. In the post-9/11 environment, Islamist groups, even those promoting peaceful political change, were labeled extremist. The Hizb ut-Tahrir, a non-violent Islamic political group, was banned in every Central Asian country. Thousands of people were arrested just for owning religious books or attending underground study circles. Governments claimed they were preventing terrorism. In reality, they were suppressing any independent Islamic voice that could challenge their authority. And the irony: the more they suppressed religion, the more underground it became. Young people began turning to radical online teachings or traveling abroad to find real Islam. Some even joined extremist movements, not because they were deeply ideological, but because they had no access to legitimate religious education at home. From Forgotten Republic to Security Partner in this new global narrative, the idea of a forgotten Islamic Republic was completely erased. No. One talked about the short-lived Islamic Revolution of the 1910s. No one remembered the dream of a united Central Asia under Islam. All that remained was a region where religion was monitored, scholars were censored, and Islam was tolerated only when it served the state. The concept of Islam as an identity, as a foundation for governance, or as a unifier of people was reduced to just a private spiritual experience, if not a problem to be managed. As the West began reducing its involvement in Central Asia during the 2010s, another power quietly but firmly took its place: China. Unlike the US, China didn't demand democracy, human rights, or even accountability. It only wanted one thing: stability and access to markets, resources, and routes. In return, it offered something Central Asian leaders couldn't resist: money without questions, projects without protests, partnerships without politics. But that came with a hidden cost. Faith was expected to stay invisible. The Belt and Road Initiative and the New Silk Silence. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), a multi-trillion-dollar plan to connect China to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East through trade corridors. Central Asia was a key link in this new Silk Road. Railways were built in Kazakhstan. Pipelines were laid through Turkmenistan. Roads and dry ports sprouted across Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. China called it win-win cooperation. But for the region's Islamic roots and religious movements, it was more like watch and stay quiet. Why? Because just across the border, in China's own Muslim-majority Xinjiang region, silent war against Islam was unfolding. The Xinjiang factor of Islam is a threat again in Xinjiang, where millions of ethnic Uyghur Muslims live. China began a brutal campaign. Mosques were demolished. Beards and hijabs were banned. Over 1 million Muslims were sent to re-education camps. And yet, the governments of Central Asia said nothing. Why? Because China was now their #1 investor, lender, infrastructure builder. Speaking out meant risking their economic future. So instead of defending the Uyghur Muslims, many of whom share cultural and even family ties with Central Asian people, the leaders chose silence. And in some cases, it even helped China by deporting Uyghur refugees back across the border. The Islamic Republic, buried again. Once upon a time, the people of Central Asia dreamed of an Islamic Republic, a place rooted in justice, brotherhood, and faith. But now, the West saw Islam as a security threat, China saw Islam as a social disruption, and local rulers saw Islam as a challenge to power. And so, the forgotten Islamic Republic was not just forgotten, it was buried under oil pipelines, trade agreements, and state propaganda. But Yanni stories never truly die, especially not stories soaked in faith, resistance, and memory. In the final parts ahead, we'll explore what remains of Islam in Central Asia today, the underground spiritual revival, and whether a new generation might one day dream that same dream again. After the brutal suppression of the Turkestan autonomy, the Soviet regime didn't just stop at military conquest. What followed was an even more insidious campaign, one that aimed to erase the memory of the Islamic Republic entirely. Soviets understood that power over history was just as important as power over land. So they launched a comprehensive program of cultural sterilization. Historical records were destroyed. Libraries were purged, and any literature, documents, or testimonies related to the short-lived autonomy were deemed counter-revolutionary and eliminated from public access. The older generation, those who had witnessed the coconut autonomy with their own eyes, were silenced either through fear, imprisonment, or execution during Stalin's purges. Schools were ordered to remove any reference to the early Muslim-led democratic experiment. The idea was to make future generations believe that no such republic had ever existed. A forgotten republic buried not just in time but intentionally beneath layers of rewritten history. Even the religious leaders and Islamic scholars who had supported a democratic Islamic framework were systematically targeted. Thousands were arrested under accusations of pan-Turkism or religious extremism, charges fabricated to eliminate anyone who could remind the public of a time when Muslims ruled themselves democratically. Even for a moment. And it worked. For decades, there was no mention of the Turkestan autonomy in Central Asian textbooks, Soviet encyclopedias, or university curricula. People grew up without knowing that their grandfathers had once voted in democratic Islamic elections. Entire generations were taught a version of history that began with Lenin and ended with Moscow. But history has a strange way of surviving, Yani, even in silence, even in whispers. A few voices dared to remember. A few dusty journals survived. In private homes, and one day, those voices would echo again. While the Soviet regime tightened its iron grip over Central Asia, not everyone surrendered to silence. In the ancient cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, once jewels of the Islamic world, there existed hidden pockets of resistance. And not with weapons, but with words, memory, and prayer. Families passed down forbidden stories of the Turkestan autonomy in hushed voices behind thick walls. Grandfathers spoke to their grandsons not in public halls, but in candle-lit basements, reciting names of leaders long erased from the official record. Muhammadian Tinyashpav, Mustafa Choke, Nasreddin Maxim, men who had dreamed of a nation. Guided by Islamic principles and democratic values, exile became a sanctuary for many memory keepers. Some fled to Afghanistan, India, or the Ottoman remnants, carrying their ideals with them. In Istanbul, a small group of Central Asian exiles began collecting whatever documents, photographs, or articles they could find from 1917 to 1918. They feared that without such effort, the flame of the Republic would die forever. These weren't politicians anymore. They were archivists of a buried truth. Desperately preserving history against a regime determined to rewrite it, inside the USSR, religious leaders kept the memory alive in the form of coded sermons. Verse from the Quran would be followed by a cryptic tale of a lost land where Muslims once chose their own path. Even under the threat of imprisonment or death, a few brave mullahs continued this subtle form of defiance. These spiritual custodians didn't need guns. They wielded history like a sword and kept alive a vision that had once flickered in the winter of 1917. And even in silence, its names held power. The very word Turkestan became dangerous. Soviet. Authorities replaced it with administrative jargon. Uzbek, SSR. Tajik, SSR. Turkmen, SSR. Each a splintered identity, crafted to divide and control. But the people still remembered the old map, the one drawn not by colonizers, but by dreamers. A united Turkestan, an Islamic republic. Vision too pure, too bold, and too dangerous for the empires of the 20th century to tolerate. They tried to erase it, but the memory clung to the soil, to the call to prayer, to the ink on secret pages, and to the hearts of those who whispered stories in exile. It lived quietly, stubbornly, and with a fire that no regime could truly extinguish. After crushing the Turkestan autonomy, Soviet regime moved swiftly, not just to silence the voices, but to reshape the entire mental map of Central Asia. In Moscow's dark bureaucratic chambers, borders were drawn with cold precision, carving up regions that had lived in cultural and spiritual unity for centuries. The people who had once prayed in the same mosques, spoken dialects of the same Turkic tongue, and shared centuries of Islamic learning were now told they were different. nations with different languages, histories, and loyalties. It wasn't just political. It was psychological warfare. In 1924, Soviets began what they called the national delimitation of Central Asia, from the ashes of Turkestan. They created new republics: Uzbek SSR, Turkmen SSR, Kazakh SSR, Kyrgyz SSR, and Tajik SSR, with new identities, new flags, and new schoolbooks. The very idea of a unified Islamic republic became a dangerous fiction. Children were no longer taught about the Bukhara Caliphate or Timurid scholars. Instead, they learned about Moscow, Lenin, and the Soviet dream. Arabic script, once used for Turkic and Persian languages across the region, was abolished. First, replaced with Latin and then Cyrillic. This was not mere modernization, it was linguistic exile, designed to sever the people from their past. Without their script, old texts became unreadable. Ancient Islamic manuscripts were locked away in state libraries, or worse, destroyed. It was a slow erasure, generation by generation. But the most brutal truth, it worked. By the 1950s, many young Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and Turkmen had no memory of a united Turkestan or the brief glimmer of an Islamic republic. They grew up calling Moscow their capital. They read Russian books, watched Soviet films, and served in the Red Army. The revolution of 1917 had become a ghost story, one that even their grandparents were too afraid to speak of. The forgotten Islamic Republic was no longer just forgotten by the world, it was being forgotten by its own descendants. And yet, in hidden corners, in old libraries, in fading diaries buried beneath the dust, traces of that lost dream remained. While Soviet architects rewrote maps and histories, they also launched an unrelenting war on faith itself. The Islamic Republic that once envisioned a future built on Sharia, scholarship, and self-determination was now reduced to whispers behind locked doors. Every mufti, imam, or Sufi elder who had once rallied around the Turkestan dream became a suspect. They were branded as enemies of the revolution, not for violence, but for believing in a different future. Mosques that once echoed with the call to prayer now stood abandoned, or repurposed into warehouses and government offices. Madrasas, once the heartbeat of Central Asian learning, were shuttered. Some were turned into Soviet training schools, others were simply demolished. Books of fiqh, hadith, and philosophy were confiscated, burned, or hidden by desperate hands. Thousands were sent to gulag camps across Siberia, often without trial. Their crime? Teaching the Quran in secret, wearing a turban, refusing to renounce their Islamic identity. Inside those frozen prisons, the dream of the Islamic Republic lived on in murmured duas, in shared memories, and in stories told under the watch of armed guards. But this was no ordinary repression. It was systemic cultural cleansing. Children were taught to report parents who prayed. Young minds were filled with slogans like "Religion is the opiate of the masses." Loyalty to the Soviet state was the new creed, and Allah was replaced by Lenin. Yet against all odds, resistance never fully died. In mountain villages of Kyrgyzstan, in desert settlements of Turkmenistan, and in the ancient alleys of Samarkand, old men gathered quietly at dusk, passing on knowledge, reciting verses, preserving fragments of a vanished republic. Some did so with fear, others with fierce, defiant hope, for the Soviets could jail bodies and erase maps, but they could not silence the soul of a people who remembered. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union had all but succeeded in wiping the Islamic Republic of Central Asia from living memory, at least on the surface. Cities gleamed with red banners, factories roared with Stalin's dreams, and Russian became the enforced tongue of administration. But in the shadows, a silent revolution was brewing, in back alleys, basements, and remote yurts. A new form of education emerged, one unregistered, unofficial, and dangerously illegal. These were the hidden madrasas, small groups of boys and girls, often no more than 6 or 7, would gather after dusk. Their school books hidden beneath rugs, their Qurans wrapped in cloth and kept in clay jars underground. Old scholars who had survived the purges, blind from torture, scarred by exile, passed down the oral traditions of Islam. They taught quietly, often without books, relying on memory, rhythm, and whispers. Each student was a vessel for history. The Republic lived through them. In these madrasas, children didn't just learn verses, they learned about what came before the Soviets. They were told of a time when Turkestan had its own currency, its own parliament, its own scholars, and its own flag, green and white, with crescent and star. Stories of the Republic became folklore, almost mythic, yet real enough to burn in the hearts of the youth. This secret education posed such a threat to the regime that the KGB launched Operation Silk Veil, an organized campaign to hunt. These networks, dozens of teachers were disappeared. Children were interrogated. Some were sent to state-run orphanages to be cleansed of religious influence. And still, the madrasas returned, like spring grass breaking through Soviet concrete. Faith found cracks in the system. A language that wasn't allowed to be spoken publicly found sanctuary in the hearts of the determined. The flame of the Republic, once extinguished, had found its new home in the memories of the youngest generation, and that Yanni was something even the Soviets couldn't rewrite. By the 1960s, as the Cold War raged between superpowers, a quieter war of identity continued deep inside Central Asia. The Soviets believed they had crushed the soul of the old republic, but they had underestimated one group. The exiled scholars, thousands of Central Asian intellectuals had fled during the republic's fall. Many found refuge in Turkey, India, Afghanistan, the Middle East, and even Europe. While their homes were taken and names erased in the Soviet archives, they carried with them something far more powerful: memory. In Istanbul, Tashkent-born historian Dr. Yusuf Bek began compiling forgotten manuscripts smuggled out of Bukhara and Samarkand. In Cairo, a former mufti from Andijan delivered lectures about Turkestan's short-lived freedom in front of wide-eyed university students. In Delhi, Central Asian poets wove tales of loss, exile, and resistance, their verses dripping with longing. For the land once free, these exiles formed academic sanctuaries, its underground circles, publishing houses, small journals titled things like The Star of the Steppes or Republic Remembered. Though their reach was limited, their impact was generational. They became the outside voice of a forgotten nation. By the 1970s, these scholars began contacting Central Asian families still inside the USSR through coded letters and radio broadcasts. Through Radio Free Europe, faint whispers of the republics. Stories slipped back into Uzbek homes. Grandchildren secretly tuned in, wondering, what was Turkestan? Was it real? Could it come back? For the Soviet regime, this was more than inconvenient, it was dangerous. A memory you could not erase was a revolution you could not predict, and in every exile who remembered, the Republic still lived. In a dusty attic in Istanbul, a young boy named Murad discovered something buried beneath his grandfather's old books, a hand-drawn map of Turkestan. It was yellowed, torn at the edges, and labeled not in Russian, but in Persian and Chagatai Turkish. The map wasn't just a relic, it was a claim. It showed borders never recognized by Moscow, cities renamed by the Soviets, and tribal lines that the world had long forgotten. His grandfather, once a cartographer in the Republic's short-lived government, had secretly made copies of the last official map before fleeing Bukhara, had hidden them across Europe in mosques, libraries, and even buried under stone graves marked with fake names. That same year, in Paris, a researcher working on Eurasian identity stumbled upon a copy. In a second-hand shop, in Tashkent, an underground student group began redrawing the map from memory, sharing it in whispers, calling it the real nation. What the Soviets erased with ink and fire, the diaspora redrew with memory and ink. And in every new map drawn, by a hand that remembered, the Islamic Republic of Central Asia existed again, not as territory, but as truth. In 1991, as the Soviet Union finally fractured, the Central Asian republics were suddenly independent, but not truly free. Presidents who once served under Moscow simply replaced their Soviet titles with national ones. Flags were changed, but the minds behind them stayed the same. The Islamic Republic was not restored. It was buried even deeper. But not everyone forgot. In a remote village near the Fergana Valley, elders gathered in silence. That night, in a mud brick mosque lit by candlelight, a young muezzin raised a flag no one had seen in 60 years, green, black, and white, stitched by hand, marked with the ancient crescent and the star. The people bowed their heads not in political protests, but in prayer. To them, it wasn't about borders or rebellion. It was about identity. A flag was more than cloth. It was a memory, a prayer stitched into fabric. Across the borders, whispers grew louder. In Kabul, a refugee recalled seeing that flag in his childhood. In Ankara, a historian wept upon recognizing the symbol during a lecture. It was real. It had returned, if only in hidden corners. And for the first time in decades, someone whispered, "We were never erased, just silenced." The internet changed everything. In the early 2000s, a quiet digital movement began, in obscure forums, in hidden Telegram channels, and buried beneath language filters. Young Central Asians started asking the forbidden. What was the Islamic Republic before the Soviets? Why did it disappear? Why don't we study it? They began sharing old photographs, grainy images of Bukhara scholars, the last assembly in Samarkand, handwritten Quranic rulings from the 1920s. A few even tracked down descendants of exiled leaders now living in Iran, Turkey, and Germany. A page called The Forgotten Republic went viral in 2015, not with propaganda, but with history, real documents, real names, real pain. University students in Kazakhstan cited it in papers. TikTokers in Kyrgyzstan used the forgotten flag in aesthetic edits. A rapper from Uzbekistan dropped a track called Yashil Bayrak, the Green Banner, mixing old Islamic verses with new rebellion. It wasn't about restoring borders. It wasn't about war. It was about memory and the right to remember. And so, a republic once buried in Soviet archives began to breathe again, not in politics, but in pixels. Today, no official map shows the Islamic Republic of Central Asia. No government acknowledges its brief, sacred existence. Its name has been omitted from textbooks, its leaders faded into footnotes. But in quiet homes across the steppes, elders still tell stories that begin with, "When we had our own republic." A carpet merchant in Tashkent keeps a faded flag in his cellar, passed down by his grandfather. A retired imam in Dushanbe still recites the khutbah the way his father did under the banner of the crescent. And in a small, dusty library in Bukhara, one shelf holds the only known surviving copy of the Republic's constitution, handwritten. Smuggled out before the Soviets burned the rest, it exists. Not as a state, but as a legacy. It was not perfect. It was short-lived. But for a flicker in time, just 4 years, an entire people stood up and said, "We are Muslims, we are Central Asians, and we will govern ourselves with justice, in faith." And though the world forgot them, they remembered themselves. That is the story of the forgotten Islamic Republic of Central Asia, buried under Soviet ash, revived in whispers and screens, and still alive in hearts that refuse to forget